The laser level projected a thin crimson line across the obsidian glass paneling of the corridor, and my entire world depended on that line not wavering by a single millimeter. I was 4 minutes into the 15-minute sync, standing in the absolute center of sub-level 4, my muscles locked in a state of isometric agony. Sweat was a cold, slow-moving insect crawling down the bridge of my nose, but I couldn't blink, and I certainly couldn't reach up to wipe it away. To move was to introduce kinetic energy into a space that was currently being recalibrated to handle the weight of 5 million people living 60 stories above my head. The sync was a period of forced inertia, a mechanical necessity for the dampeners to reset. But as I stared at that red line, I felt a distinct, rhythmic tapping against the heel of my left boot. It wasn't the machinery. It was 3 sharp, deliberate strikes, followed by a pause, then 3 more. It felt like a finger, bone-dry and insistent, signaling from the very floor I was forbidden to vibrate. The job at the Philadelphia Inertia Buffer wasn't something you found on a public board. It found you when you were desperate enough to stop asking why the salary had 5 zeros, and the contract had a non-disclosure agreement that felt like a suicide pact. 6 months ago, I'd been a forensic structural engineer with a mortgage, a reputation, and a 7-year-old daughter named Avery, who was slowly losing her ability to hear the world. The doctors called it progressive auditory neuropathy. I called it a ticking clock. The specialized treatment she needed cost more than I made in 3 years, and after I'd been blacklisted for refusing to sign off on a cut-rate skyscraper project in Rittenhouse Square, I was radioactive. Then came the man in the charcoal suit, with a folder containing my daughter's medical records and a map of a facility that technically didn't exist. The entrance was hidden inside a decommissioned SEPTA substation near Girard Avenue. You didn't descend by elevator, you descended by a pressurized industrial lift that took 4 minutes to reach the staging area. My supervisor, a man named Miller who looked like he'd been carved out of gray soap, didn't shake my hand. He just handed me a tablet and a pair of steel-toed boots with internal gyroscopes. He told me the city above us was a living, breathing creature of steel and glass, and that every time a subway car turned a corner or a skyscraper swayed in the wind, that energy had to go somewhere. The buffer was that somewhere. It was a massive underground shock absorber designed to catch the trash energy of the city and bleed it into the bedrock so Philadelphia didn't shake itself into a pile of bricks. "There are 5 rules to staying alive in the LVP," Miller had said, his voice as flat as a Dead Sea. He didn't call them rules for the job. He called them the conditions of your continued biological presence. He explained them as we walked through the first airlock. Rule 1. Maintain local inertia. No sudden movements in the buffer zones. Rule 2. The 15-minute sync. Every 4 hours, stay perfectly still while the load shifts. Rule 3. Disregard phantom feedback. The acoustic dampeners produce white noise that mimics human speech. Ignore it. Rule 4. Seal the secondary dampeners. Never touch a door labeled closed by structural order. Rule 5. The mirror protocol. Do not look at your reflection in the obsidian panels during a shift. I'd nodded, my mind already calculating the hours I'd need to work to pay for Avery's first round of surgery. I figured it was just high-level industrial safety. I was wrong. The tapping on my boot continued, growing more insistent as the 11th minute of the sync began. The crimson laser line on the wall began to hum, not a sound, but a visual vibration that made my vision blur. I kept my eyes locked on the horizon, my breath shallow and controlled. The obsidian panels lining the hallway weren't just glass. They were a composite material designed to swallow sound, but in the low light of the sync, they acted like dark, bottomless mirrors. I could see the silhouette of my own body, a rigid shadow against the blackness. And then I saw the other shadow. It wasn't mine. It was standing 3 feet behind me, a thin, elongated shape that didn't have the bulk of a man in a safety vest. It was reaching out, its arm extending toward the small of my back, and I knew that if I turned, if I moved even an inch to avoid that touch, I would break Rule 1 and Rule 2 simultaneously. The weight of the city above me felt like it was pressing down on my skull, a literal mountain of concrete waiting for a reason to collapse. When the green light finally flickered at the end of the hall, signaling the end of the sink, I didn't scream. I didn't even turn around immediately. I collapsed onto my knees, my joints popping like dry kindling, and stared at the floor. There was nothing there. No fingers, no shadows, just the dull, matte finish of the vibration-grade steel. I checked the gyroscope in my boots. The readout was steady, but the log showed a micro spike at the 12-minute mark. A tiny tremor that shouldn't have been there. I stood up, my legs shaking, and wiped the sweat from my eyes. I had to report it to Miller, but as I reached for my radio, I remembered the way he'd looked at me during the orientation. He hadn't looked like a boss. He'd looked like a man watching a candle burn down, wondering when the wick would finally hit the wax. I found Miller in the monitoring hub, a circular room filled with seismic graphs that looked like the heartbeats of a panicked animal. He didn't look up when I entered. He was staring at a screen that showed the structural integrity of the Comcast Technology Center, 500 feet above us. The needle was twitching. I told him about the tapping on my boot. I told him about the shadow in the obsidian. I expected him to tell me it was the phantom feedback or Rule 3, just my brain trying to make sense of the silence. Instead, he reached into his desk and pulled out a small, copper-plated coin. He set it on the table. It was perfectly flat on one side, but the other side had been worn down until the metal was translucent. "You're a structural guy, Elias," Miller said, his eyes finally meeting mine. "You know about resonance. If you hit a wine glass at the right frequency, it shatters. If the city hits this facility at the right frequency, it doesn't just shatter. It unhappens. The rules aren't there to keep the facility safe. They're there to keep you from becoming part of the dampening cycle. The panels don't just swallow sound, they swallow intent. If you think there's someone behind you, the buffer thinks there's someone behind you, and the buffer doesn't like extra weight." He pushed the coin toward me. "Carry this. If it starts to feel hot, you've stayed in one spot too long. And for God's sake, stay away from sublevel 6. The seals on the doors down there aren't just for air pressure." The first few weeks were a blur of aching joints and the relentless low-frequency hum of the city breathing above me. I learned to walk without shifting my center of gravity, a slow gliding gait that made me feel more like a ghost than a man. The pay hit my account every Friday. $10,000, tax-free, wired from an offshore account that didn't have a name. It was enough to get Avery into the first phase of her treatment at the Children's Hospital. Seeing her smile when she realized she could hear the sound of the nurse's footsteps in the hall was the only thing that kept me from losing my mind in the dark. But the buffer was changing me. My dreams were no longer about skyscrapers or blueprints. They were about the obsidian panels. I would wake up in my small, subsidized apartment, my hands moving in my sleep, trying to trace that red laser line across my bedroom wall. My wife had left years ago, and Avery lived with her grandmother during the week, so I was alone with the silence, or what I thought was silence. I began to hear the city even when I wasn't at the facility. I could feel the vibration of the broad street line in my teeth while I was eating dinner. I could hear the elevators in the skyscrapers 3 miles away as if they were moving behind my eyes. One night, during a routine patrol of sublevel 3, I found something that wasn't in the manual. Near the main dampening coil, where the vibrations from the city were at their most intense, the obsidian paneling had cracked. It wasn't a structural crack. It was a series of symbols etched into the glass from the inside. They looked like equations, but the variables were wrong. They were using time as a measure of mass, and grief as a measure of kinetic energy. As I reached out to touch the glass, a voice whispered from the darkness of the coil housing, Don't touch the math, Elias. It's still being solved. I spun around, my boots almost slipping on the steel floor. It was the woman I'd seen before, the one with the burnt hair. She was huddled in the shadow of the coil, her eyes wide and reflecting the dim red light of the emergency beacons. She looked thinner than before, her jumpsuit hanging off her skeletal frame. "Who are you?" I whispered, my hand hovering over my radio. "I was the precision walker for the North Quadrant," she said, her voice like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "That was before the load shifted in '98. They told me I was the anchor, just like they told you. But the buffer doesn't want anchors, it wants fuel." She stepped out into the light, and I saw that her hands were gone. From the wrists down, her arms ended in smooth, rounded nubs of obsidian glass. She didn't look like she was in pain. She looked like she was becoming part of the architecture. "Rule 4, Elias," she whispered, pointing toward the sealed door at the end of the hall. "They tell you never to touch it because they don't want you to know what's on the other side. But the child is calling. Can't you hear her?" I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. "My daughter is at home. She's safe." The woman laughed, and the sound was identical to the chime my tablet made when a message arrived. "Is she? Or is she just another frequency the buffer is using to keep you in line? Check the logs, engineer. Check the timestamps on the medical bills." She vanished back into the shadows before I could ask her anything else. I stood there for a long time, the low-frequency thrum of the city vibrating through my skull. When I finally got back to the monitoring hub, I didn't go to Miller. I went to the secondary terminal, the one used for archival storage. I bypassed the security encryption using a backdoor code I'd discovered during my second week, a simple structural override that the system designers had overlooked. I searched for the medical bills. I searched for the hospital records, and then I saw it. The payments weren't going to the children's hospital. They were being routed into a private research account owned by the same holding company that managed the buffer. The medical reports I'd been receiving every week weren't from a doctor. They were generated by an AI designed to mimic the progress of auditory neuropathy. My daughter wasn't getting better. She wasn't even at the hospital. I felt the world tilt. Not a perceptual tilt this time, but a visceral, soul-crushing realization. I reached for my radio, but it was already buzzing in my hand. "Elias?" Miller's voice crackled. "We've got a microfracture in sub-level 5. The dampeners are losing sync. We need you down there, now." "I'm not going anywhere, Miller," I spat, my voice shaking with rage. "Where is Avery? Where is my daughter?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the city above us. "The buffer requires a specific frequency to maintain the balance, Elias," Miller said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. "Avery has that frequency. She isn't in a hospital because she's more valuable here. She's the reason the city didn't fall last year. She's the heart of the dampening field." "You son of a bitch!" I screamed, breaking Rule 1 as I lunged for the door. "I'm going to kill you." "Rule 5, Elias," Miller whispered. "Look at the screen." I looked at the terminal. The archival footage was playing. It showed a small white room in the deepest part of the facility, sub-level 6. In the center of the room sat a chair, and in that chair was Avery. She was wearing a small headset, her eyes closed, a peaceful expression on her face. Around her, the walls were made of the same obsidian glass as the rest of the facility, but they weren't swallowing sound. They were amplifying it. The vibrations of the entire city were being funneled into her headset, and her brain, her unique damaged auditory nerves, was acting as a biological processor, filtering the noise into the perfect stable inertia the buffer needed. "She doesn't feel anything," Miller said. "She's in a state of perfect resonance. If you pull her out, the buffer fails. The city collapses, and she dies instantly from the kinetic backlash. The only way she stays alive is if you stay in the buffer. You're the anchor, Elias. You keep the facility steady, so she can keep the city steady. It's a closed loop. I stood in the center of the monitoring hub, the red lights of the alarms beginning to pulse. I looked at the copper coin in my hand, the one Miller had given me. It wasn't a safety tool. It was a weight. The sync starts in 3 minutes, Elias. Miller's voice echoed through the speakers. If you're not in position, the load will shift onto her, and she's not strong enough to hold it alone. I didn't answer. I turned and ran toward the service lift. My boots hammered against the floor, each step a violation of the inertia I had spent weeks perfecting. The air in the corridor was beginning to shimmer, the reality around me warping under the stress of my movement. I could see the obsidian panels cracking as I passed, the symbols I'd seen before glowing with a fierce violet light. I reached the entrance to sub-level 6. There was no door, only a shimmering veil of black oil that seemed to hang in the air. I stepped through it, and the world disappeared. I was standing in a forest of black obsidian trees, their branches reaching up toward a sky filled with the glowing lights of a city. I could see the bottom of the Comcast Center, the foundations of the city hall, all of them hanging above me like giant precarious ornaments, and there, in the center of the grove, was the chair. Avery opened her eyes. She didn't look like she was in a trance anymore. She looked at me, and her smile was real. "Daddy," she said, and her voice was perfectly clear, as if her neuropathy had never existed. "I can hear everything now. I can hear the people laughing. I can hear the cars. I can hear the stars." I walked toward her, my footsteps silent on the obsidian moss. "Avery, we have to go. We have to leave this place." "We can't," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If I leave, the music stops. And if the music stops, the people fall. I don't want them to fall, Daddy." I reached for the headset, but my hands were beginning to shimmer, the same way the woman's had. I looked down and saw that my skin was turning to obsidian glass. "Rule 6, Elias," a voice whispered from the trees. It was the masked man, the one I hadn't met yet, but whose presence I could feel in every crack in the floor. There is no escape from the balance. There is only the choice of who holds the weight. I looked at my daughter, and then I looked at the city hanging above us. I realized then that Miller was right. It was a closed loop, but every loop has a break point. "Avery," I said, my voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates, "close your eyes, and don't stop listening to the music." I didn't pull the headset off her. I sat down on the floor next to her chair and pressed my hands against the obsidian moss. I began to hum. Not a song, but a frequency. The frequency of my own grief, my own rage, my own desperation. I became a dampener. I began to pull the trash energy of the city into myself, bypassing Avery's headset, acting as a secondary buffer. The world began to shake. The obsidian trees shattered, the sky above us turned a bruised purple, and I could hear Miller screaming somewhere in the distance. "You're breaking the sync! You're going to kill us all!" "No," I whispered, the obsidian spreading up my arms, toward my chest. "I'm just shifting the load." The last thing I saw before the light swallowed everything was Avery's face. She wasn't afraid. She was looking at me, and for the first time in years, she could hear me perfectly. "I love you, Daddy," she said. And then, the buffer collapsed. I woke up in a room that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. The light was too bright, a harsh fluorescent white that made my head throb. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy as if they were made of lead. I looked down at my hands. They weren't made of glass. They were flesh and bone, but they were covered in fine white scars that looked like lightning bolts. "Mr. Thorne, can you hear me?" A nurse was standing over me, her face a mask of professional concern. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice a raspy ghost. Where is she? Where's Avery? The nurse smiled, a gentle, reassuring expression. She's in the recovery room, Elias. The surgery was a success. The doctor said they've never seen anything like it. Her auditory nerves, it's like they've been completely regenerated. I felt a wave of relief so intense it made me dizzy. I closed my eyes, the memory of the obsidian forest fading like a bad dream. It was over. The facility, the buffer, Miller, it was all gone. How did I get here? I whispered. A passerby found you both outside the old Girard Avenue substation, the nurse said. You were both unconscious. They said there was a minor earthquake, a localized tremor that opened up a sinkhole near the station. You're lucky to be alive. I nodded, the pieces of the story falling into place. A sinkhole, an earthquake, the city's way of explaining the unexplainable. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the hospital, the beeping of the monitors, the murmur of the voices in the hall, the hum of the air conditioning. It was a beautiful, chaotic noise. But then I felt it, a slow, rhythmic tapping against the frame of my hospital bed. 3 strikes, a pause, 3 more. I froze. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't move. I waited for the sensation to pass, for my brain to realize it was just a phantom feedback, a residual memory of the LVP. But the tapping continued, growing more insistent, moving from the bed frame to the mattress, then to the sole of my foot. Mr. Thorne? Is something wrong? I opened my eyes and looked at the nurse. She was still smiling, but her eyes... For a fraction of a second, I saw it, a flash of obsidian glass. No, I whispered, my heart beginning to hammer in my chest. Nothing's wrong. I looked toward the window. The city of Philadelphia was there, the skyscrapers gleaming in the afternoon sun. They looked stable. They looked solid. But as I watched, the Comcast Technology Center seemed to sway just a millimeter, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that only a structural engineer would notice. I reached out and grabbed the nurse's hand. Her skin was cold, too cold. Rule 1, I whispered, the words coming from a place deep inside my marrow. Maintain local inertia. The nurse's smile widened, her teeth white and sharp. The sync is over, Elias. The new cycle has begun, and you're already in position. I looked down at the floor, and I saw the red laser line. It wasn't on the wall anymore. It was tracing a path across the hospital linoleum, heading straight for the door to the recovery room where my daughter was sleeping. I stood up, my legs shaking, the leaden weight of my limbs vanishing as the familiar low-frequency thrum of the city began to vibrate through my skull. I didn't call for help. I didn't try to run. I knew what I had to do. I began to walk, a slow, gliding gait, my center of gravity perfectly balanced. I followed the red line out of the room, through the hall, toward the elevator. The other patients, the doctors, the visitors, they didn't see the line. They didn't feel the vibration. They were just the trash energy the city produced every day. I reached the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. As the doors closed, I saw my reflection in the polished steel. My eyes were gone. In their place were 2 smooth, bottomless voids of obsidian glass. The elevator began to descend, not to the basement of the hospital, but deeper, farther down than the sewers, farther down than the subways, down to the place where the city's heart beat in the dark. I was going back to work. Because the city was heavy, and the debt was never paid, and somewhere in the deep, a child was still listening to the music. And I had to make sure she never stopped. The descent didn't feel like gravity. It felt like the world was being sucked out through a straw, leaving me in a vacuum where the only thing with any weight was the obsidian voids where my eyes used to be. The elevator doors didn't open with a chime. They shivered apart, the steel groaning as if it were being asked to hold back the pressure of a deep-sea trench. I stepped out, not into the sterile red-lit corridors of the LVP, but into a space that shouldn't have existed. It was Philadelphia. But it was a Philadelphia made of charcoal and silence. I was standing on what looked like the corner of 15th and Market, right beneath the shadow of City Hall. But the stone of the buildings wasn't granite or marble. It was that same matte black sound-swallowing composite. There were no cars, no streetlights, no wind. Above me, where the sky should have been, there was only a massive vaulted ceiling of rusted iron, braced by pillars of bone-white concrete that disappeared into the gloom. This was the ghost grid, the one-to-one structural replica used to calibrate the dampeners. It was a city built to be broken, a sacrificial geography that took the hits so the real one above could stay upright. "You're late for the morning sweep, Elias," a voice said, echoing off the obsidian storefronts. I turned. Miller was standing by a replica of a SEPTA bus, but he looked different. His skin was translucent, and I could see the copper wiring of the facility's nervous system pulsing beneath his cheeks. He wasn't holding a tablet anymore. He was holding a heavy, industrial tuning fork, the metal vibrating with a low, mournful hum. "This isn't real," I said, my voice sounding flat and muffled, as if the air itself were trying to eat the words. "The hospital, the surgery, it was all a simulation. You never let us out." Miller struck the tuning fork against the obsidian bus. The sound didn't ring, it thudded, a heavy tectonic vibration that made my knees buckle. "Real is a luxury we can't afford down here, engineer. The city above had a 4.2 magnitude tremor 10 minutes ago. If we hadn't been here to catch the recoil, the Vine Street Expressway would be a mass grave right now. You didn't exit. You just transitioned from a passive observer to an active component." He walked toward me, his movements jittery and fast, like a film skipping frames. "Rule 1. Maintain local inertia. You broke that when you tried to sabotage sub-level 5. Now, you have to pay the kinetic debt. Every step you take in the ghost grid balances a foot of movement in the real city. If you stop walking, the real Market Street stops holding its load. Do you understand?" I looked down at my feet. The obsidian eyes didn't see color, but they saw stress. I could see the orange glows of structural tension leaking from the foundations of the ghost buildings. The ghost grid was bleeding energy, and it was my job to walk it out. "Where is Avery?" I demanded, the amber scar in my palm flaring. "She's the governor, remember?" Miller gestured upward toward the iron ceiling. "She's the one who tells the ghost grid how to move. She's the conductor. You're just a boot on the ground. Now start walking, north toward City Hall. There's a resonance leak in the replica of the Masonic Temple. If you don't ground it, the real temple will be a pile of dust by noon." I started to move. I didn't have a choice. The moment I stood still, the obsidian ground beneath me began to liquefy, a black, oily suction pulling at my boots. The trash energy was building up, and I was the only lightning rod available. As I walked through the silent black streets, the horror of the ghost grid began to sink in. This wasn't just a model. It was a memory bank. Every building I passed was a perfect recreation, down to the cracks in the sidewalk and the gum stuck under the benches. But as I reached the replica of the Ritz-Carlton, I saw something that made me stop. There was a man sitting on a black obsidian bench. He was wearing an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in the 1920s. He was perfectly still, his hands folded over a newspaper made of thin, grey lead. He didn't have eyes. He had the same obsidian voids I did. "Don't stop, son," the man whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "The Ritz has a heavy lobby. If you stop, the chandeliers up there start to sway." "Who are you?" I asked, my heart hammering in a rhythmic mechanical beat. "I'm the sweep for 1924, he said. "The Great Depression was a bad year for the buffer. Too much emotional noise. We lost a lot of walkers back then, The city got heavy with all that despair. "You've been here for 100 years?" The man turned his head, a slow, agonizing movement. "Time doesn't move in circles here. It moves in stress loads. I'm not a man anymore. I'm just the reason the Ritz-Carlton didn't collapse during the bicentennial." I moved on, my pace increasing. The ghost grid was a graveyard of walkers, hundreds of them, each one assigned to a specific building, a specific era of Philadelphia's history. The LVP wasn't just a facility. It was a chronological heat sink. It was storing every vibration the city had ever produced, from the first brick laid in the 1600s to the latest skyscraper. I reached the Masonic Temple replica. It was glowing a fierce, angry red. The resonance was so loud it felt like my teeth were being vibrated out of my gums. I stepped onto the foundation, and the energy hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just mechanical energy, it was sound. The sound of 1,000 people praying, chanting, whispering secrets. The trash energy of the temple was spiritual, a dense, heavy vibration that the obsidian panels couldn't swallow. I leaned against the black stone, my amber-scarred palm pressing into the wall. I began to pull. I felt the prayers, the secrets, the quiet desperation of the temple's history flow through my arm and into the scar. It burned. It felt like my blood was being replaced with molten lead. But as I pulled, the red glow of the ghost building began to fade. The vibration slowed. Across the street, in the real Philadelphia, mirrored in an obsidian window, I saw the real Masonic Temple. For a second, the image was clear. A tour group was walking up the steps, a group of school children laughing and pointing at the architecture. They had no idea that a man made of glass and scars was currently absorbing the seismic debt of their lives. "Good," Miller's voice crackled in my head. "Now, sub-level 7. We have a conflict in the residential sectors. South Philly is getting loud." I headed south, my legs moving with a mechanical precision that I could no longer control. My identity was being erased, replaced by the needs of the grid. I wasn't Elias Thorne, father and engineer. I was the South Quadrant grounding rod. But as I reached the replica of a small row home on Passyunk Avenue, I saw a familiar light in the window, a soft, violet glow. I broke Rule 4. I didn't just walk past. I pushed the obsidian door open and stepped inside. The house was a perfect replica of my own apartment. The furniture was black, the walls were black, but the layout was identical. And sitting at the kitchen table was a woman. She was holding a cup of black, oily liquid, her eyes fixed on a television that was playing nothing but static. "Sarah," I whispered. "My wife." The woman who had left me because she couldn't handle the silence of our daughter's world. She didn't look up. She was a resonance echo, a manifestation of the emotional noise the buffer had harvested from my own life. "You're late for dinner, Elias," she said, her voice a perfect hollow mimicry of the night she'd walked out. "The house is shaking. Can't you feel it? The walls are coming down, and you're just standing there with your blueprints." "Sarah, this isn't real. You're not here." She turned then, and her face began to melt, the obsidian skin dripping like wax. "I'm the weight you couldn't carry, Elias. I'm the reason you took the job. I'm the friction." The house began to vibrate, not the low thrum of the city, but a sharp, jagged frequency, the frequency of a marriage falling apart. It was more dangerous than the seismic debt of a skyscraper. Emotional resonance was the only thing the LVP couldn't process. It was the wild card that caused the dampeners to fail. The obsidian walls of the row home began to warp, the violet light intensifying until it blinded me. I felt the weight of my own grief pressing down on me, a literal mountain of concrete. If I didn't ground this, the real row homes in South Philly would start to crack. Families would wake up to find their foundations turned to sand. I grabbed the ghost version of Sarah, my amber palm burning into her shoulder. "I'm sorry," I choked out. the obsidian spreading up my neck. I couldn't save us, but I'm going to save her. I pulled the grief into myself. It was worse than the temple. It was sharp, cold, and tasted of salt. I felt my heart skip a beat, then another, as the trash energy of my failed life integrated into my nervous system. The violet light faded. The Sarah echo dissolved into a puddle of black oil. I stood in the silent black kitchen, my body shaking with the effort of holding back the collapse. I realized then that the rules weren't just for safety. They were a containment protocol for the walkers themselves. We were being used to store the things the city couldn't handle. The murders, the heartbreaks, the suicides. The LVP was a landfill for the city's soul. I stumbled out of the house, my vision blurred by the obsidian haze. I had to find Avery. I had to get to the governor's seat. If she was the one conducting this nightmare, she was the only one who could end it. I headed back toward the center city of the ghost grid, but the terrain was shifting. The obsidian streets were folding in on themselves, the geography becoming non-Euclidean. I saw the Comcast Center hanging upside down from the iron ceiling, its windows glowing with a sick green light. I saw the Benjamin Franklin Bridge stretched like a harp across a chasm of black oil. "Rule 5, Elias!" Miller's voice was a scream now, vibrating through the air itself. "Do not look at the reflection. The load is shifting. The city is waking up." I looked at the obsidian windows of the inverted Comcast Center. I didn't see the real Philadelphia. I saw the future Philadelphia. I saw a city of glass and light, but there were no people. The streets were empty. The buildings were perfect, pristine, and silent. It was a city that had achieved perfect inertia. A city that had become a tomb. "That's the goal, isn't it?" I shouted, my voice finally breaking the muffled silence of the grid. "You don't want to save the city. You want to freeze it. You want to turn the whole world into a dampener." "Inertia is peace, Elias." Miller appeared in front of me, his body now almost entirely made of copper and glass. No more accidents, no more collapses, no more noise. Just the perfect, steady hum of a world that never moves. He lunged for me with the tuning fork, the metal tines glowing with a blinding white light. I dodged, my movements assisted by the kinetic energy I'd stored from the temple and the row home. I wasn't just walking anymore. I was a battery, and I was leaking. I struck him with my amber-scarred hand. The contact was like an explosion. Miller didn't fly back. He shattered. His body turned into 1,000 shards of copper and obsidian, each one screaming with a different frequency. But as he fell, the pieces began to pull back together, the facility already repairing its most loyal component. I didn't wait for him to reform. I ran for the governor's seat, which I now realized wasn't a chair. It was the massive bone-white pillar at the center of the ghost grid, the one that supported the weight of City Hall. I climbed. I didn't use stairs. I used the cracks in the obsidian, my glass fingers digging into the stone. The higher I went, the louder the music became. It wasn't the bedtime story anymore. It was a symphony of every sound Philadelphia had ever made. The Liberty Bell ringing, the cheering at the Eagles parade, the sound of 1,000,000 row home doors slamming at once. At the top of the pillar, in a small pressurized chamber, I found the core. It wasn't a machine. It was a pool of black oil, perfectly still, perfectly flat, and floating in the center of that pool was a small, glowing orb of violet light. Avery's voice was coming from the orb, but it wasn't words. It was a frequency, a pure, unwavering tone that held the entire ghost grid in place. "Avery," I whispered, reaching out with my scarred hand. The violet light flared. "Daddy, the music is so loud. It's trying to get out." "Let it out, Avery. Stop holding the beat." "But the people, they'll fall." "Let them fall," I said, the obsidian finally reaching my heart. "It's better to fall than to be frozen. It's better to be real than to be perfect." I touched the violet orb. The contact didn't burn. It was cold, The cold of a winter morning in the city, the cold of a fresh start. I felt the trash energy I'd stored, the temple's prayers, the row home's grief, the walking rod's exhaustion. All of it flowed into the orb. I was the emotional noise the system couldn't handle. I was the friction. The violet light turned a brilliant, chaotic white. The black oil in the pool began to boil, the surface breaking into a million jagged waves. The perfect inertia of the ghost grid shattered. I heard the iron ceiling above us groan. I heard the bone-white pillars begin to snap. The city above was finally going to feel the weight of its own history. "Rule 5, Elias," Miller's voice echoed one last time, sounding small and distant. "The reflection! Look at the reflection!" I looked into the boiling oil. I didn't see Philadelphia. I saw myself, not the glass-eyed monster, but the man I was before. I saw myself holding Avery in the hospital, her hearing restored, her life ahead of her. But I also saw the price. In the reflection, as the ghost grid collapsed, I saw the real city hall begin to crumble. I saw the skyscrapers swaying, the glass windows blowing out like glitter. The city wasn't just falling, it was being reborn through the destruction of its own static foundations. "Daddy, I'm scared." Avery's voice came from the white light. "Hold my hand, Avery," I said, even though I didn't have hands anymore. "We're going to fall together." The pillar beneath us gave way. The ghost grid vanished in a roar of sound and light. I felt myself falling, not through the earth, but through time, through memory, through the very fabric of the city I had tried so hard to save. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the pavement of Dilworth Plaza, right in front of City Hall. The sun was blinding, the air was filled with the smell of exhaust and soft pretzels. It was loud, gloriously, painfully loud. People were screaming, running, pointing at the sky. I looked up. City Hall was still there. The Comcast Center was still there. But they were different. They weren't matte black or obsidian. They were stone and glass, and they were covered in a fine white dust. The tremor had happened. The buildings had been damaged, but they hadn't collapsed. I looked down at my hands. They were flesh. The white scars were gone. The obsidian eyes were gone. I was just a man in a torn grey jumpsuit lying on the ground in the middle of a panicked city. "Avery," I croaked, my voice sounding like my own again. I saw her. She was standing a few yards away, her hands over her ears, looking at the cracks in the pavement. She looked exactly as she had when I'd last seen her in the real world. I scrambled to my feet, my muscles aching with a human pain. I ran to her, pulling her into my arms. She was warm, she was real, she was crying. "Daddy, it's too loud," she sobbed. "The music stopped, and now everyone is screaming." "It's okay, Avery, it's okay. It's just the world. It's just the sound of things moving." I held her, watching as the emergency sirens began to wail in the distance. The city had taken the hit. It was bruised. It was broken. But it was alive. The buffer was gone. The ghost grid had been purged. But as I stood there, holding my daughter in the middle of the chaos, I felt a familiar vibration. It wasn't in the ground. It wasn't in the air. It was in my teeth. I looked at the pavement at my feet. A small, red laser line was tracing a path across the concrete, heading straight for the foundation of City Hall. And then I heard it. 3 sharp, deliberate strikes from inside my own chest. The debt wasn't paid. The load hadn't disappeared. It had just found a new way to stay in the world. I looked at Avery, and for a second, her eyes flickered, just for a second, into a deep, bottomless violet. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice echoing with the sound of 1,000 glass bells. "Rule 7. The music never stops. It just changes performers." I looked up at the skyscrapers, and I realized that the buildings weren't just stone and glass anymore. They were waiting, they were listening, and they were hungry for the next beat. The sound of Philadelphia at noon is a sustained, frantic scream that most people mistake for the hum of progress. Sitting on the steps of Dilworth Plaza with Avery clutched to my chest, I realized that the buffer hadn't just been a facility, it had been a filter. Now that the filter was gone, the raw, unfiltered kinetic debt of 5 million lives was pouring directly into the pavement. I could feel the subway lines grinding like rusted gears beneath my tailbone. I could feel the air pressure fluctuating as the skyscrapers sucked in oxygen and exhaled carbon dioxide. The world was too loud, too heavy, and worst of all, it was beginning to recognize me as its new grounding rod. Avery pulled away from me, her eyes no longer leaking tears but shimmering with that terrifying, rhythmic violet light. She wasn't looking at the panic around us, the sirens, the shouting, the dust. She was looking at the air. Her small hands were moving in the air, tracing invisible lines of force that I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. Every time her finger twitched to the left, the groaning of the City Hall masonry seemed to soften. Every time she clenched her fist, the tremors in the ground reached a momentary, artificial stasis. "Avery, stop," I whispered, grabbing her wrists. "Don't touch it. We have to go." "I can't, Daddy," she said, and her voice didn't sound like a 7-year-old's. It sounded like a choir of glass bells ringing in a cathedral of ice. "If I stop, the buildings will remember how to fall. They're so tired, Daddy. They've been standing for so long." I looked around, desperate for a way out, but the gray suit man was already there. He didn't come in a car or a helicopter. He simply stepped out from behind a cloud of masonry dust, as if he'd been waiting for the curtain to rise. He looked exactly the same as the day he'd recruited me. Charcoal suit, silver tie, a face as forgettable as a blank sheet of paper. But now he wasn't carrying a folder. He was carrying a small, handheld device that looked like a brass metronome. "The resonance is shifting, Elias," the man said, his voice cutting through the chaos with impossible clarity. "You broke the institutional containment, but you forgot the fundamental law of structural integrity. Energy is never destroyed, it's only relocated." "Get away from her," I growled, stepping between him and Avery. My hand, the one with the amber scar, was pulsing so hard I thought the skin would rip. The pavement beneath my boots began to glow with a dull orange heat. "She is the sovereign node now," the man said, ignoring my threat. He set the metronome on a stone planter. It began to tick, a sharp mechanical sound that made my teeth ache. The LVP was a crude machine, a 20th century solution to a 21st century debt. But the ghost grid, that was a transition. You and the girl aren't employees anymore. You're infrastructure. You are the biological anchors for the city of Philadelphia. "I'm not doing it," I spat. "I'm taking her, and we're leaving." The man smiled, and for the first time I saw the obsidian voids behind his eyes. He wasn't a man. He was a manifestation of the system, a corporate ghost. "Leave? To where? The debt follows the anchor. If you go to the suburbs, the houses will collapse. If you go to the woods, the trees will shatter. You are the buffer now. Everywhere you go, you carry the weight of the city. And right now the city is very, very heavy." As he spoke, a massive crack appeared in the plaza, snaking its way from the metronome toward Avery's feet. She didn't move. She just watched the crack with a calm, terrifying intensity. When the fissure reached her, it didn't split the ground beneath her. It wrapped around her, the stone smoothing itself out as if she were a magnet for structural stability. "See," the man whispered. "She's already authoring the ground. She's better at it than Miller ever was. She doesn't need rules. She has instinct." I grabbed Avery and hauled her into my arms, the kinetic energy from her body nearly knocking me unconscious. It felt like holding a live power line. I ignored the man, ignored the metronome, and ran. I didn't go toward the street or the crowds. I went toward the only place I knew that could handle this kind of friction: the river. The walk from City Hall to the Schuylkill River should have taken 20 minutes. It took us 3 hours. Every step I took felt like I was wading through waist-deep molasses. My boots were smoking, the rubber soles melting into the asphalt. Whenever I passed a building, I could hear the windows rattling in their frames, the glass singing a high panicked note that followed us like a swarm of hornets. I was dragging the city's debt behind me like a ball and chain, and the friction was tearing me apart. By the time we reached the boardwalk near the Walnut Street Bridge, the sun was setting, casting a long, bloody light over the water. Avery was silent, her head resting on my shoulder, her violet eyes fixed on the bridge above us. The massive stone pillars of the bridge were vibrating, a deep tectonic bass that I could feel in the marrow of my bones. "Daddy," Avery whispered. "The bridge is hungry. It wants to go for a swim." "It's not going anywhere, honey," I said, my voice sounding like gravel in a blender. I sat her down on a wooden bench, my own legs finally giving out. The wood charred beneath me, the smell of burning pine filling the air. I looked at my hand. The amber scar had spread. It wasn't just a mark on my palm anymore. It was a network of glowing veins that reached up to my elbow. My skin felt hard, cold, and brittle. I was turning into a grounding rod, literally. The obsidian was reclaiming the flesh. "Elias." I didn't turn around. I knew the voice. It wasn't the man in the charcoal suit. It was Miller. But it wasn't the Miller from the facility. This version of him was ragged, his grey jumpsuit soaked in black oil, his face a roadmap of scars and glass fragments. He was leaning against a lamppost that was bending toward him as if drawn by a gravitational pull. "You can't keep her out here," Miller said, his voice wet and labored. "The open air is too noisy. The trash energy is too chaotic. If she stays in the world, she'll burn out in 48 hours. Her brain isn't built to process the delta waves of 5 million people without the obsidian housing." "I'm not taking her back to that hole," I said, my teeth clenched against the vibration. "Then she dies," Miller said simply. "And when she dies, the anchor snaps. The recoil will be enough to drop every bridge from here to the Delaware. The city will unhappen, just like I told you. You think you're saving her, but you're just turning her into a slow-motion bomb." He walked toward us, his footsteps leaving scorched prints on the boardwalk. "There's a sovereign node beneath the river, an old pumping station from the 1880s. It's built into the bedrock. It's got enough natural obsidian to act as a shield. We can take her there. We can stabilize her." "We?" I laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You're still working for them, even after they turned you into a piece of scrap metal." Miller looked down at his glass hands. "I don't work for them, Elias. I work for the stability. I work for the music. Once you hear it, once you realize that the only thing keeping the world from screaming is your own heartbeat, you don't care about who signs the checks. You just want the noise to stop." He reached out a hand toward Avery. She didn't flinch. She looked at him with a strange, tragic recognition. "He's the one who was here before, Daddy," she said. "He's the one who stayed in the dark so I could sleep." I looked from Miller to Avery, the weight of the decision pressing down on my skull. If I took her home, she'd burn out. If I took her to the pumping station, she'd be a prisoner. But there was a third option, an option the rules hadn't mentioned. "Rule 8, I muttered, more to myself than to them. Miller frowned. "There is no Rule 8. "Yeah, there is," I said, standing up, the amber light in my arm flaring until it was painful to look at. "The buffer doesn't have to be a person. It just has to be a connection." I grabbed Miller's hand. The contact was like a lightning strike. The copper wiring in his skin and the obsidian in my veins fused instantly, creating a circuit that roared with the kinetic debt of the city. I felt the vibrations of the Walnut Street Bridge, the Market Street line, the Comcast Center, all of it funneled through the two of us. "What are you doing?" Miller screamed, his glass eyes cracking under the pressure. "I'm shifting the load," I grunted, my teeth beginning to shatter. I reached out with my other hand and grabbed the metal railing of the boardwalk. "Avery, now! Give me the music!" Avery didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and placed her small, cold hands on top of ours. The violet light in her eyes exploded into a blinding white, and for a second, the three of us weren't people anymore. We were a single, glowing filament in the dark, a biological bridge spanning the gap between the city and the earth. I felt the trash energy pouring through me. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was everything. I felt a mother in West Philly tucking her kid into bed. I felt a doctor in a trauma ward losing a patient. I felt a couple arguing over a bill, a baker pulling a fresh tray of rolls out of an oven, a dog barking at a shadow. It was the beautiful, messy, crushing weight of 5 million lives, and I was holding it all. I pushed the energy through Miller and into the railing. The metal didn't melt. It began to hum, a deep harmonic tone that resonated through the wooden boardwalk, into the stone pillars, and down into the very heart of the bedrock. We weren't grounding the energy. We were broadcasting it. We were turning the city itself into its own dampener. The metronome in the distance stopped ticking. The gray suit man vanished into the shadows, his presence no longer required. The city of Philadelphia didn't fall. It didn't freeze. It just settled. The tension that had been building for 300 years released in a single silent sigh. When the light finally faded, Miller was gone. There was nothing left of him but a pile of fine white ash and a few shards of obsidian glass on the wooden planks. The railing I'd been holding was no longer metal. It had been transformed into a beautiful translucent amber that glowed with a soft internal heat. I collapsed onto the boardwalk, my body feeling lighter than it had in months. The amber scar on my arm was gone, replaced by a series of faint silver lines that looked like a map of a city that didn't exist yet. My eyes were normal. My heartbeat was my own. I looked up at Avery. She was standing at the edge of the boardwalk, looking out at the river. The violet light was gone from her eyes. She looked like a normal 7-year-old girl again, tired, messy, and very, very small. "Daddy," she whispered, turning to me. "The music is different now." "What does it sound like, honey?" I asked, pulling her into my arms. She tilted her head, listening to the city behind us. "It sounds like everyone is breathing at the same time." We stayed there for a long time, watching the lights of the city flicker on across the water. The skyscrapers were still swaying, but it wasn't a panicked vibration anymore. It was a dance, a slow, rhythmic movement that felt like a heartbeat. The buffer hadn't been destroyed, and it hadn't been moved. It had been integrated. The debt was still there, but it wasn't being stored in a hole in the ground anymore. It was being shared by every person, every brick, and every soul in the city. I eventually walked her home. We didn't take the bus. We walked through the quiet streets of North Philly, our footsteps sounding loud and clear on the pavement. Nobody stopped us. Nobody noticed the silver lines on my arm or the way the streetlights seemed to dim slightly as we passed. We were just two more people in a city that had finally learned how to hold its own weight. I got a job at a local engineering firm a few weeks later. No non-disclosure agreements, no grey suits, no obsidian panels. I spend my days checking the structural integrity of old row homes and my nights telling Avery bedtime stories that don't have any secret frequencies hidden in their words. Her hearing is perfect. Better than perfect, actually. Sometimes she'll tell me she can hear the flowers growing in the window box or the sound of the moon moving across the sky. I don't tell her she's imagining it. I know better. But every now and then I'll be standing in the kitchen, washing the dishes or making coffee, and I'll feel it. A slow rhythmic tapping against the sole of my foot. 3 sharp, deliberate strikes. A pause. 3 more. It isn't a warning anymore. It isn't a debt. It's a greeting. It's the city, checking in, making sure the anchor is still there, even if the anchor is just a man living a quiet life in a 2-bedroom apartment. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the city is loud, I look out the window and see a figure standing on the corner. A man in a charcoal suit, his face a blank sheet of paper, watching the building sway in the breeze. He doesn't move. He doesn't speak. He just stands there, a reminder that the balance is always shifting, and the music never truly stops. I don't look at my reflection in the windows anymore. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll see, but because I already know. I am the reason the ceiling doesn't fall. I am the friction that keeps the world from sliding into the abyss. And as long as Avery is sleeping peacefully in the next room, I don't mind the wait. Because the final rule, the one they never tell you until it's too late, is the only one that actually matters. Rule 9. You can only save the world if you're willing to become the thing that holds it together. I took the job, I held the line, and now the city is breathing. I just hope I never have to see the metronome start ticking again. The city is quiet tonight, but beneath the silence, I can hear it. The heartbeat of 5 million people, all in sync, all moving together. It's a heavy song, but it's a good one. And for the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of the high friction zones, because I'm not the only one listening anymore. We are the buffer, and the music is just getting started.